Welcome back to Sacred Synergy. Today is Thursday, June 11th, and this is episode 13 featuring Andrew Davis. Andrew M. Davis, PhD, is an American process philosopher, theologian, and scholar of the cosmos. He is research and academic director of the Center for Process Studies, where he researches, writes, teaches, and organizes conferences on various aspects of process-relational thought. An advocate of metaphysics and meaning in a hospitable universe, Andrew approaches philosophy as the endeavor to systematically think through what reality must be like because we are part of it. He is author, editor, and co-editor of nearly a dozen books, including Mind, Value, and Cosmos on the Relational Nature of Ultimacy, Process Cosmology, New Integrations in Science and Philosophy, Metaphysics of Exo-Life, toward a Constructive Whiteheadian Cosmotheology, and most recently, Whitehead's Universe, a Prismatic Introduction to Alfred North Whitehead. This conversation is being released on the heels of the American Tarot Association's annual retreat, which was held this last weekend, or rather 2 weekends ago, in May at Dalesford Abbey. The retreat was a resounding success and continues to be a critical component for building community and connecting with like-minded and spirited people in the physical realm, participating in the local exchange of electrons that simply cannot be emulated virtually. We hosted guests from 15 different states as well as Mexico, and Don Viney, our keynote speaker, was magnificent. Don spoke about process thought in relation to the cosmic vision of Teilhard de Chardin, and he even treated us to some songs on his guitar. We shared lots of great fellowship at the conference and time together over food and drinks and at evening socials. And we had lots of books for sale, including my own, which I was happy to be hustling and selling and signing copies of. So that was really cool experience to be able to connect with friends, both old and new, in that context now as an author. On that note, you can purchase Sacred Synergy through the publisher, Paul's Press, or on Amazon. And I want to say thank you to all of you who have already purchased a copy or copies. I know some of you have purchased multiples, and I'm just incredibly grateful for your support. Don't forget that the Center for Christogenesis has their 10th anniversary conference at the end of November, or at the beginning of November at Villanova University, and I look forward to seeing you all there. So my conversation today with Andrew Davis, just prior to the ATA's retreat at the end of May, was an important primer for me because it gave me a better foundation when it came to understanding process thought. Andrew mentioned some key names such as Alfred North Whitehead, Henri Bergson, and Teilhard de Chardin, as well as important concepts such as the notion that becoming takes precedence to being within the process world. Andrew discusses how process thought is not new, yet emerges from the classical schools of philosophical thought globally, and how the torch has been carried into the modern day. As Teilhardians, I think that most of you will find a familiar resonance between Teilhard's thought and the key ideas of process thought. Andrew does a wonderful job at walking us through these topics as a solid introduction to the field, and our conversation goes on to discuss how Andrew's own evolution as an educator and thinker who is shaping the field through his own exploration of more novel concepts such as psychedelics, extraterrestrial life, artificial intelligence, and beyond. As we discuss, these are areas that are in great need for deep thought and careful development in today's world, as their prominence in the mainstream makes them societally relevant and something that should be taken seriously. It's something that we cannot scoff at anymore. One of my main takeaways from process thought is how we might always have an openness to the ways that God is working through the universe and through our human experience to draw us closer toward a greater sense of becoming and wholeness, and how these ways are usually beyond our foresight or ability to anticipate. If we truly stay open, we can find God in all things. Today's conversation whets your appetite for process thought. Be sure to check out Andrew's books as well as his online courses exploring Whitehead's universe. Those links can be found in the details of today's episode. And now it's time to sit back and enjoy this conversation at the heart of evolution with Andrew Davis. Andrew, thanks so much for joining us on Sacred Synergy.
Andrew, thank you. It's good to be here.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to make your acquaintance. This is the first time we're meeting virtually here in our effigy, so to speak, on Zoom. And I was just commenting how I had stumbled upon your work a couple of years ago, and then through Center for Process Studies, Center for Christogenesis, American Tarot Association, I was able to make this connection with you. So grateful for this time today.
Likewise, Andrew. Yeah, there's a lot of strands I think that bring us together here. So happy to join the podcast.
Yeah, I'm excited to see where this conversation goes. But before we get into that, please tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do with most of your time in the world.
Yes, great. Okay, well, yeah, I'm Andrew Davis, of course. As viewers know, I'm a process philosopher and theologian, working principally in the tradition of Alfred North Whitehead and the schools of thought known as process philosophy and theology that take their inspiration from his name, and of course not just his name. You referenced Christogenesis, the center, of course, Teilhard de Chardin, Henri Bergson, a number of others part of the modern process tradition. And my current role is to lead research and program direction for the Center for Process Studies, which is, for those who don't know, a nonprofit research organization dedicated essentially to espousing, the reach and the relevance of process-relational modes of thought to all variety of disciplines, all from psychedelics to extraterrestrial life to AI. I know we'll probably get there, and a host of other questions across science, philosophy, and culture. And we were founded in 1973 as a faculty research center of Claremont School of Theology. Originally, John B. Cobb Jr. and David Griffin were the pioneering founders. And so we've had a 50-year duration of organizing, manifold different conferences across issues. And we still are related to Claremont School of Theology, just not as closely. I still teach courses for them and whatnot. But my main time is spent in organizing conferences, writing books, teaching courses, generally networking with scholars of process philosophy around the world in topics that I think are cutting edge, topics that face our civilization. And of course, I do other things too. I'm a stepdad, I'm a son myself, I'm a brother, I'm a soon-to-be husband, and generally a citizen of this cosmos that can be found in Northern California, discussing these themes across, coffee shops and breweries. So that's one way to answer.
No, I love that. I appreciate that candid answer. And congratulations too on an upcoming wedding. That's something to look forward to. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing about a little bit about your role within the Center for Process Studies. So a question, is that a brick and mortar, or are you guys primarily online?
Yeah, so great question. Historically, we were located there in Claremont. We had this sort of Platonic-like cave under the amphitheater where we had all our archives and resources, and we had staff and students working there. It's been an interesting evolution post-COVID, like for many organizations. So now we are primarily a virtual center with employees working at different places around the nation. So we still meet in person, but we don't have a standard address. Our archives are elsewhere. We hope to bring them into a contact with students again. But it's an interesting time, as you probably know, post-COVID, and just the way in which work and location has shifted, for many, many people. But we stay totally active in the online space, and when needed, we have in-person conferences. But it's a kind of hybrid mix now.
Yeah, no, that's great. Yeah, we're all adapting. We're all augmenting our operations here. For people that are new to the field of process thought and theology and philosophy, can you briefly describe what that is?
Yeah. So there's a number of ways to do so, right? And one of the easier ways, I'd say, is to say these are schools of thought, right? They're schools of thought that have ancient origins, certainly, and a variety of modern expressions, and they're schools of thought that are based in certain intuitions about the nature of reality, and in particular, the fluid nature of reality. So one of the fundamental intuitions that draws process thinkers together is this claim that becoming is more fundamental than being, right? That reality is, if you want, verb-like before it's noun-like, and that process and fluidity and interconnection have a primary foothold in reality over and against stasis, isolation, or static sort of substance. That's one overarching statement, but I think maybe a comment just on history is important here too, because there's all sorts of ancient antecedents of process style thinking, right? If you think of the movements of thought from China to India to Greece, arguably they've all had these deeply fluid sort of intuitions. So certainly for the West, Heraclitus, right, the great pre-Socratic philosopher, is often said to be the ancient founder of process philosophies, right? Ponta re, he says, all things flow. Yeah. And most people have probably heard this refrain that you can't step in the same river twice, right? Which is often uttered in reference to Heraclitus.
Yeah.
But Heraclitus had detractors, right? Parmenides and the atomists, often argued that change was illusory, or what was fundamental were inert atomic bits, right, that move about through space but have no internal growth or movement in terms of themselves. And so that's been a long and important debate throughout the history of philosophy. It is the nature of things best conceived in terms of process or permanence, right? Stasis or flux. And so that debate we've inherited as a tradition. And to make a long historical story short, the philosophical tradition, I'd say, largely took the way of permanence and stasis, right? In the sense that what is fundamental are substances that have a persistent identity and changes which are merely accidental. But there's always this other stream, this fluid stream running from Heraclitus up through more minor voices, arguably, in the philosophical tradition. So to jump to modern science, to the period in which Whitehead and Teilhard arguably are working, here are folks that can be said to be reawakening Heraclitus for the modern world and pointing to the ways in which the development of the sciences themselves are pushing us back to a process-relational ontology, right? Matter dissolving into energetic activity. The fixity of species blending with, organic evolutionary development, and, gravitational push and pull relations, bursting into field-like potentials and waves, right? And so there's all these ways in which Heraclitus comes back via Whitehead, via Teilhard in the context of modern science. And so, to again cut things shorter, but process thought, process theology, and philosophy are metaphysical traditions that are based in the primacy of fluidity, becoming, relationality, and we read that from top to bottom in nature, and from bottom to top, right, all the way up to conceptions of divinity, where relationality, change are of the essence of the divine life. But we can come to that, of course, when you're ready.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that answer, and I appreciate you breaking down things in a more historical context for the audience. We can follow that, and it was very helpful for me as well. I think the first time I read the name or heard the name Heraclitus was through the name or the bard Terence McKenna, who I think was probably my first exposure to process thinking in that way, if you will. And that was before I kind of got into theology. If anything, he was a great impetus for me to start taking this stuff seriously, and and yeah, it's really cool to see now you put a bit more of an intellectual and coherent framework in terms of a context of how that tradition has progressed, and why it's very relevant today too.
I certainly think so. And I just think that historical backdrop's important because, traditions don't emerge from nowhere, right?
Yeah.
Traditions have lineages, and there's ancient strands of thought that are reawakened in modern forms that are really quite inspiring, right? So in calling it a school of thought, we're reaching back to the past, but we're also talking about creative developments currently. And it hasn't, although it's been a rather minor stream, arguably, in terms of how philosophy developed today, I think it's being reawakened in really compelling ways. That we'll, I suppose, come to.
Yeah, and all of those, like you said, all things flow. And I'm thinking, going back to that example of McKenna, I mean, yes, he eventually became known as a philosopher, a great bard, writer, all those things, but he was really an ethnobotanist when it came to like his background, and historian in that way, and how that river all flowed, to the future in that way. So a little bit more about you now, Andrew. How did you find your journey leading you into process thought? And what convinced you that it was worthwhile to pursue and that it mattered?
Awesome. Yeah, well, all of it, frankly, comes back to my MA work at Claremont School of Theology. I was a young, eager graduate student and decided to take a course titled Ministry and the Problem of Evil, right? Because like most, I found evil and suffering to be a challenge and difficulty for theological conviction, this question of theodicy. So I, enrolled in that course and found out that this course essentially was an introduction to process theology and a process take on that question. What we ended up doing was reading a variety of process theologians, even some of Whitehead himself. And I think I was immediately struck by the alternative, that was presented to a supernatural theism on the one hand, which arguably exacerbates the problem of evil from which it stems, and an atheist sort of materialism, which arguably doesn't do much better, right? So process theology began to show me an alternative way of framing these issues in a perspective of divinity that's always persuasive and never coercive, right? A perspective that doesn't lay evil at the feet of a God that could stop it, sees evil as the inherent shadow side of a world that self-creates, right? So theodicy is the context in which my discovery of process thought happened as a young graduate student. But that class was also significant because it pushed me to clarify my metaphysical assumptions. And a lot of my assumptions at the time were simply assumptions of a reductive kind of materialism. I just assumed that that's the way the world worked. That's the way things were. And the class pushed me to really ask about the nature and character of the world at a metaphysical level, to question those longstanding assumptions. And so it started a trajectory, in other words, for me, right? And so I would take 2 years between my MA and PhD work teaching high school students. I thought it would be a break. It wasn't. and during that time, I read Whitehead voraciously and decided to return to study process philosophy distinctively in my PhD work. And so I returned to Claremont to do so, and been working with process philosophy ever since. But let me say something for why it matters, right? Because that's an important question. There may be any number of ways to answer that. It matters in the first place because truth matters, right? And trying to get as close to the truth of things matters. It matters because, as Whitehead rightly states, as we think, we live, right? In other words, there's no such thing as sort of a philosophically neutral position with respect to the mysteries that we faced. And part of the purpose of philosophy is to awaken or lay bare those unspoken assumptions that our species has. So it matters, I think, because theory and practice go together, and ideas have consequences, and they're not all equal, right? These ideas matter. Truth matters, even if we pretend it doesn't. I think of a great statement Whitehead has. He says, paraphrasing, every working scientist, to preserve his reputation, has to say he dislikes metaphysics. What he really means is he dislikes having his metaphysics questioned, right? So there's this background underlying metaphysical assumptions that I think we have to lay bare. I didn't know I had those. Process philosophy helped me realize that I did. Yeah. And reading Whitehead helped me learn philosophy in a way that was always attentive to those underlying metaphysical assumptions. So finally, I think it matters because it reconnects, at least the process vision helps reconnect human beings in a context of continuity and becoming and belonging, right? Experience for Whitehead is an exemplification of nature and not an exception to it, right? What that immediately does is reconnect us with the wider unfolding of this universe, attune us to our experience as revelatory as to the nature and character of things. So Whitehead in this regard is a radical empiricist, and calling us always back to attend to our experience as giving us clues about where to start the task of philosophy. So it ran from theodicy issue through Claremont to teaching to reading, back to Claremont, and now of course to the Center for Process Studies, where all this comes together in some interesting way.
That's excellent. And just candidly, were you coming from a certain faith or spiritual tradition when you were in that master's program?
Yeah, I mean, generally, was raised Protestant evangelical tradition. Okay, certainly on my mom's side, right? So that was, I'm sure you know of that persuasion, as it were. Yeah. And process thought gave me a lot of resources to rethink, to reconstruct. After deconstructing evangelical perspectives, and I appreciate the tradition, the Christian tradition. I'm still within the Christian tradition, albeit much more expansive than my youth.
Yeah, we find ourselves overflowing that container we were raised with often, and it's then seeking a larger container to capture that overflow. Or I think maybe a more appropriate analogy is a community in that way. And it sounds like you've found that niche there with the Center for Process Studies and all these organizations you're connecting with.
And I just think I didn't realize in the beginning that philosophy is not sort of optional, right? You can choose not to do it. You can choose not to have a metaphysics, and yet, there's always one at play. So, metaphysics, philosophy, science, they all go together, right? Whitehead says there's no shortcut to truth, right? You have to mine the best of our disciplines,
Yeah.
the best of human experience. And the task of philosophy is to find a worldview that does justice to the variety of forms of experience we encounter,
Yeah, yeah. So, how would you say that process thought is helping to reshape the way that we are understanding things like consciousness, divinity, our relationship to divinity, and especially in this context of evolution?
Yeah, great. Well, I mean, in the first place, it does so because it's asking us to shift our fundamental picture of reality itself, right? So
Mm.
again, rather than beginning with static substances or isolated things, right? It begins with events, right? Relationships and becoming, excuse me, as fundamental. So, for the process tradition, the world is not made up of a conglomeration of inert objects that somehow interact externally, but it's a growing process of dynamic events that are evolving in relation to each other. So this obviously will impact how we think about these notions you mentioned, right? Consciousness, for example, for process thinkers is not some alien anomaly which just happens to emerge out of what is otherwise inert and dead matter, right?
Mm.
Rather, consciousness, and especially the richer forms that we enjoy, is a highly developed expression of more basic experiential constituents that make up reality itself. In fact, Whitehead argues that reality is made up of experiential events, what he calls actual occasions or actual entities,
Yeah.
that are dimly analogous to the events that we experience now in these waking states. But at the fundamental level, these events for Whitehead are they're not conscious themselves, right?
Mhm.
But they are experiential, and this is an important distinction, arguably, between a pan-experientialist claim where experience goes all the way down, and what's often thought to be the claim of panpsychism, right, where consciousness, in some sense, goes all the way down. So Whitehead holds to pan-experiential, so experience goes all the way down. Consciousness genuinely emerges over compounding and layered routes of complexification of experience at very high levels of evolutionary complexity, the kinds of complexity that we enjoy. So mind and experience pervade nature. Dead matter is replaced by creative experience, and consciousness is the kind of inevitable outcome of the compounding evolution of experience at very high grade kinds of levels.
Mhm.
So now, obviously, if we think about God and the cosmos, all this is going to adjust as well. So divinity is not going to be a distant, unmoved mover outside the world, occasionally interacting, but rather deeply involved, participating, persuading rather than coercing the process of things. Now, we can go into more detail about God if you want to, but you mentioned the cosmos too. The cosmos is not some wound up mechanical machine from the distant past, which is unfolding upon a deterministic aim. It's deeply participatory. It's a kind of infinite adventurous process that is the result of divine world collaboration, right?
Mhm.
The image is, for process thought, that God offers the possible, but awaits for the world to make it actual, right?
Mhm.
And possibilities are always persuasive, right? A possibility has never pushed you over or taken your money, right? A possibility is the presentation of an option awaiting your choice, right? So the point being that the God cosmos relationship is genuinely collaborative, genuinely participatory, and it makes for an open-ended adventure for both human beings, all creatures, and for the divine life itself, which is often a challenge to more standard visions of divine omniscience, which knows the future as actual in one timeless now. Process thinkers, process theologians generally argue that's a sort of incoherent position, but
Mhm.
it's an ongoing debate.
So, Andrew, if you could please repeat that last thing, they regard the future as actual. Is that what you said?
Well, partly the standard claim about, at least classically understood, divine omniscience is the notion that God's knowledge is God knows in one timeless now, past, present, and future, right? In other words, God knows the future as actual, and it raises the question of creativity and freedom, of course, right? So, to put it in a sort of jesting way, if God knows, tomorrow you're going to have ham and eggs, and you do, could you have had Cheerios instead, right? playful, but when it comes
Right.
to Auschwitz, when it comes to, the Holocaust, I mean, is it really the case that God eternally knew these things as actual
Mhm.
from all time? Or are they results of the fact that the world and God unfold together into an open future? The claim of omniscience from process perspective is that God knows all that can be known. In other words, the future as an array of possible outcomes, possible states. But what is not actual cannot be known, right?
Mhm.
God knows the world as it is, as an unfolding arena of possible achievements.
Mhm.
Um, and that makes, things genuinely open for both God and the world.
Thank you for clarifying that. When you said that word, it immediately pinged in my antenna, my Teilhardian antenna, because that is one of the four qualities of the omega point is
Oh,
actuality.
okay.
And it
Yeah,
resonates with the definition that you gave there. So I appreciate that. And as you're talking
sure.
about inert matter and process theology, kind of breaking that open and changing the way we look at that kind of thing, I'm also feeling this very Teilhardian resonance where for Teilhard, all forms of matter have consciousness, even if it's a very basic rudimentary level of consciousness, i.e. within, the dirt and dust of the earth, there is
Yeah,
still an internal component that has pulled those atoms, those molecules together to combine this complexity of earth, dirt, whatever you might want to call it, that
yeah,
we don't look at as being consciousness, or we as being conscious in the way that we often, might approach the world. But then you mentioned like the panpsychist approach, where
hmm
we're looking at the consciousness, very ubiquitous thing, and I think that's where we're starting to see a lot, or at least I'm seeing a lot of intersection between my background in Teilhard and your background in process theology here, especially Whitehead. And that's just
yeah,
exciting for me to see these intersections. And I'm sure there's a whole lot more to explore academically, intellectually, with footnotes and, citing them. But it's cool just to have this
sure.
conversation with you and to feel that resonance. And that's something that I really appreciate about the kinship that people like yourself, myself, Ilya, all these great
hmm
thinkers out there in these realms, is that we don't always need to be speaking the same language, but we're touching on the same themes and core concepts. And in that, there's a resonance, there's an affirmation, and there's a learning. Like I'm learning a lot from you in these first 20 so minutes that we've been together. So I just want to
Right
affirm
on.
that.
Oh, totally, totally. Yeah, I mean, well, we can come to the Teilhard connection if you'd like. I mean, since you mentioned it there, I mean,
Sure.
yeah, I mean, Teilhard is without doubt a process thinker, right? That doesn't need to be argued anymore. It seems to be
Right.
obvious. Um, I have a forthcoming introduction to Whitehead. I finally finished it, coming out in October, and I have a nice little section. I think it's chapter 4 or 8 on the modern process tradition. I have a nice section on Teilhard. You
Nice.
mentioned you mentioned Ilya. I mean, you may be familiar with the book Ilya and I edited, Whitehead and Teilhard. From
Yep.
organism to omega, in which we put these two pioneering, if you want, strands of modern process thought into dialogue with one another. And yeah, there's no doubt there's deep resonances there. Teilhard is a panpsychist or a pan-experientialist. Again, the language becomes hairy because we have to identify what that means. Teilhard is clear that it's not consciousness per se, like the consciousness we enjoy, that
Right.
goes all the way down, but there is that interior psychic element, which is,
Yeah.
well, at a base level experiential, but probably not conscious. So I think he and Whitehead are pan experientialist thinkers or panpsychist thinkers.
Hmm.
And both having a robust critique of a cosmos that is static, right? So Teilhard is taken, is elbowing the cosmos of Aristotle and saying, well, we need
Yeah.
cosmogenesis, and both emerge through different intellectual trajectories against the backdrop of cosmic evolution, right?
Hmm.
Teilhard asking who will finally give evolution its own God, right? And he
Hmm.
offers an answer, and so does Whitehead in this regard, right? And that's in part a picture of God that's, at once the primordial ground of the possible, right? Those possibilities that are being achieved throughout evolution, and
Hmm.
also the experience of the actual in some deep sense. And of course, there's, you know, differences too. Teilhard's thought seems to be a bit more deterministic or teleological in a sort of necessary way. Of
I was just
course, we
going to
can
say that. Yeah. Hmm.
argue about that, the omega point and whether or not that will be or must be achieved. Whereas Whitehead's universe is, while sharing a lot of affinities, more open-ended, more creative,
Okay.
more chaotic and free in that regard. In
So
short,
does
they're
White?
allies. Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry, Andrew.
I was just to say they're absolutely allies. They didn't know each other per se.
Mhm.
Whitehead, contemporaries for a time, but Teilhard being younger than Whitehead. So there's no evidence Whitehead knew Teilhard, but there's one bit of evidence my colleague Don Viney shared with me. It's in this book, Whitehead and Teilhard, where Teilhard encourages his friend Pierre Leroy with the
Mhm.
statement. Um, he says, "What does he say?" He says, "Hold fast, as Whitehead states, the spirit of adventure." Right. So
Nice.
here's perhaps one signal that Teilhard at least read or knew something of Whitehead. Maybe his book Adventures of Ideas or Science in the Modern World. Um, anyway, there's a lot to say there.
Sure, sure. So then, my question was that I had interrupted you was, does Whitehead make a commentary about this? For Teilhard, it's teleological. It's also eschatological. It's
Mm-hmm.
soteriological. It's like all of these things in Omega. Does White have
Yeah.
something similar that he points to as like an endpoint of the cosmos in that way?
I mean, at a prima facie level, I'd say no, right?
Okay.
So it's a truly open, infinite process.
Hmm.
That doesn't mean there can't be certain forms of culmination, but there's not, to the extent the omega point is interpreted to mean the process stops once it's reached. And I
Hmm.
don't think that's Teilhard's perspective,
No,
right? But
no.
but if that were, Whitehead would certainly not be.
I'm incorrect. I phrase it
Yeah,
as an endpoint to the cosmos, which is not correct, but a point
right.
of fullness, cosmic fullness, right? Wholeness.
Yeah, and even there, I think Whitehead would be skeptical, partly because, and I mean, there is teleology absolutely in Whitehead's universe.
Hmm.
His famous line from Adventures of Ideas is the teleology of the universe is directed toward the production of beauty. Um, but precisely because arguably aesthetic achievement is inexhaustible, there is no final culmination where all aesthetic values would be achieved, leaving nothing remaining, right? So one might say that the very fact that the universe strives for beauty is what grounds its infinite process, right? In some way. I don't know if you've read a book by James Carse called Infinite and Finite Games. It's a beautiful book. He makes this distinction between a finite game, which you play for the sake of winning, and once you've won, the game stops. That's it. Um, and an infinite game, which you play for the sake of playing, right? So for Whitehead, certainly the universe is an infinite game, right? You play for the sake of achieving aesthetic value and seeking deeper magnitudes of aesthetic achievement, which are in principle exhaustible. So beauty is at the basis of no final end or culmination. There, having said that, of course, there can be different forms of order that emerge, right? Cosmic epochs, as Whitehead calls them, that emerge and pass away. So a lot of it depends on how you reference the culmination or how you articulate the ending. And process eschatology remains an interesting field of study. There's certainly not an eschatology in the sense that all things end, right? It's an infinite process. And that makes some people nervous.
Well, that's kind of the name of the game. If you're in, the theology, philosophy world, you've got to be comfortable with being uncomfortable, right? You've got to be certain about uncertainty. So,
Yeah,
yeah, I
totally,
don't know
totally.
how well that applies to other fields of study or practice, but certainly in
Mm,
this line of work, yeah. So yeah, you talked about these resonances that we see between process theology, particularly with Whitehead and Teilhard.
mm,
What would you say are some like real practical use cases that either maybe you're living out in your life where you can like identify this as like a process
mm,
take on an event or a happening in your life, or maybe an example that you see out there in the world? I mean, maybe,
mm.
something you're involved with.
Yeah. I mean, it's a great question. I think process thought becomes practical at one level because it's a reminder that reality, or it reminds us that reality, again, is not made up of isolated, inert atomic structures,
Yeah.
right? But relationships and patterns of becoming. So we ourselves are not fixed entities enslaved to noun like patterns of the past, although we can be that. But rather we're adventuring and moving forward. There's something that releases the past from always repeating itself, right? There's trajectories or avenues of novelty that, if we choose, can change our circumstances and change who we are. Um, And so I think process thought at a practical level pushes us to ask different questions, right? How am I, for example, being shaped by my relationships? Or what possibilities of novelty or of value, truth, beauty, and goodness are entering my experience, are available in this moment, right? So it's, I think, less about advocating our fixed identity and more about being open to the rhythms and the flows of reality as they manifest in us. And so, I mean, you can see how this would change various practical situations like leadership, right? The point of a leader is not to, be domineering or deterministic in, your confrontation with those you lead, right? It's about bringing the best out of the relationships that are in your kin, right? Or spirituality, it's not about, escaping the world by any means. It's about living more deeply into it. It's about cultivating a sense and awareness for the fact that you're always coming into being moment by moment through your relationships, and about rendering your experience transparent to divine lures, as process thinkers would call it, to be the best that you can be in this moment, the contextual best. Even if that's the lesser of two evils, right? We get ourselves in a bind, and it's like there's only so many possibilities for us. And the role of the divine life in this regard is to offer you a way out of the stagnations of your past. Right. So spirituality is about cultivating a transparency to the wider lures of possibility that, in their realization, release us from certain stagnations in the past. It applies in many ways. Think of politics too. I mean, politics is not about, right, again, warring atomic units that are fundamentally divided, right? Even though it is that, right? But what would happen? What would change if we began to see interdependence and relationality as constitutive of who we are? We're not first individuals that happen to find ourselves in relations. It's quite the reverse, right? We're, as Panikkar suggested, interdividuals, right? We arise out of our individuality arises out of our interdependence. So theoretically, there's so many ways in which this can be fleshed out practically, but that's not to say that there's one easy policy program or easy solution to the problems we face, right? Process thought offers as a background worldview in a deep way, a background metaphysics, reshaping how we've understood ourselves, and challenging that assumption that's been based in independence and isolation, calling us back towards interdependence and relation. And there's no telling what sort of impact that can make, I think.
Yeah, when you initially started in explaining process or philosophy as this notion of becoming having a greater place than being, I think that really speaks to your answer to my question there regarding like what are some practical use cases and examples. And I remember when I was probably in, I don't know, let's say high school, when we learned about how our cells replenish every 7 years in our body. And then you go into high school and you learn about atoms and whatnot and molecules. And then, I come into the thought of Pierre Desjardins as a young man who's trying to discern, like, what does I'm from the Catholic tradition, like, what does that faith mean to me? What are these, heavily philosophical concepts have to do with my life, and how do they make it any better, the world any better, and stuff like that. And at some point, and I think it was really through, an affirmation of what you're saying regarding experience and having lots of life experiences as a younger adult, my early 20s, where my mental framework and experiential framework of reality was drastically being shifted. And these are experiences of, deep inner journeying, of, traveling outside the world, of doing service, meeting with other forms of people and culture and whatnot. And I'm just really grateful I found Teilhard within that mix, because I think if I did not, I would probably still really be struggling with my faith as a Catholic with these concepts that are, put in a more traditional language. And then you have a thinker like him who's able to transpose it into something that is resonating with the more quantum worldview that we're presenting now through this really domineering paradigm of science. And that paradigm of science, like you said, largely speaks to a materialistic approach to reality. But then the quantum challenge is that, as to break that down into, was it vibration? Is it a wave? Right, all these different things, and or particle wave rather, and then it's a matter of, okay, well, how do I put that together? Where is that point of synthesis where I can hold these sometimes maybe seemingly conflicting perspectives in union with each other? Because, like you said, truth matters. And at least
Yeah.
for me, it was like, I got to get to the bottom of this. And I think I realized at some point I'll never get to the bottom of it. And there's that becoming over being, right? But in
Yeah.
that, there is, at least in my own, I'll just speak case, I've found a great sense of both comfort and challenge in a greater sense of my being and who I am through being open to those experiences that I've had and am still having in my life. And also, like you said, just being open to life as it happens and the fact that we are not static, we're something that's dynamic, continually changing. And so
Yeah.
should our thought be, therefore.
Absolutely. Yeah. And no, I think that's beautiful. And I think, again, some people are turned off to, the linguistic edifice of process thought because it is challenging, right? Whitehead's language is very challenging. Teilhard writes more smoothly. Whitehead is a beautiful writer. I mean, not to put shade on Whitehead. There's times when I'm reading a passage of Whitehead and Teilhard, and I have to sit back and just sort of pause,
Yeah.
and ruminate, because they have a way of filling a paragraph with such insight. You have to be like, wait a minute, like I need to sit back and grasp that. The final chapter of my upcoming intro to Whitehead is called Transitions for the Future, right? And it's my attempt to take all that the book does. It's a pretty adventurous book, and say, well, what does it come to? What does it mean for us individually and collectively? And I look at 10 practical transitions in our ideas, or call it life orientation or even spiritual transitions, and speak to those a bit. I won't rehearse them here, but there are transitions like from exception to exemplification. What changes practically when we see ourselves not as an exception to everything that's going on, but an exemplification of the deepest nature and character of the world? Lots changes. The transition from being to becoming, right? Or from mechanism to organism, or from passivity to creativity, or pessimism to possibility. There's all these different transitions that are embedded in a process philosophical framework that really have practical touch points with life, and the challenge of ecological degradation or political fragmentation or spiritual alienation. All these things really matter. And back to Whitehead's statement, how we think we live, right? Ideas matter, and it's good for us to get clear as best we can. I'm not saying truth is some obvious thing that we hold, right? It's like the sun in Plato's cave, right? You can't look at it. It's there and it shines upon you and you see its shadows, but it's not something you can fully grasp. That doesn't mean we don't try, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I see the theory and the practice absolutely being a part and parcel of a process worldview. Both belong, right? And one of the critiques, of the armchair philosophers, they're so heavenly minded, they're no earthly good. And there might be an honesty there for some, but we also have to practice philosophy. Keep in mind the original meaning of philosophy is a guide for life, right? Mm-hmm. Wisdom, philosophia, knowledge knows and wisdom does, right? The philosopher has to act and live.
Yeah.
The unexamined life is not worth living, yes, but the unlived life is not worth examining, right? So examination and life, they have to flow together. And I've found that the current of process philosophy, especially in Whitehead, also in Teilhard, is a beautiful way of doing that.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. And just curious, when you find yourself dialoguing, like you say, you come from an evangelical background, when you find yourself maybe dialoguing with, say, family or friends, or just someone you might meet through the center, who comes from a background that maybe is not exposed to this mode of thinking or these more expansive paradigms, and you begin to dialogue about, say, Whitehead or process thought or some of these more complex themes that require a bit more of an integrated awareness, how do you find yourself navigating that tension? And is there ever any follow-up from those folks where they're maybe like, hey, I don't totally agree with you, but I see what you were talking about now? Did you ever have anything like that happen with you?
Oh, sure. Yeah, no, that's great. Absolutely. I mentioned, previously that I taught high school kids, you know, at my old evangelical high school where I attended as a student. Again, for 2 years in between MA and PhD work. That was a really fun experience because here I am growing and expanding, in ideas and experiences at Claremont. And then I come back to this small pond where I once lived, as it were, once lived and swam around. So it was a creative challenge to be of service there because I clearly wasn't going to simply rehearse the I told the students we're not simply going to rehearse what our parents have told us here, right? We're going to try to make our faith our own. We're going to think
Yeah.
deeply. We're going to ask hard questions because that's what it means to take this stuff seriously, to make your faith your own. So, but I learned quickly that I had to be careful in how I went about doing that. Um, this is something I've learned over time too. It's like, I used to be hostile to my evangelical roots and, arguing and debating, and like there's a place for that. But I think it's all about the way in which you enter that conversation. Compassion is required, right? When people lose their worldviews, they're often seeking something new, right? Something that will re-enchant them. I think process thinking does that, but it requires some skill. You don't just want to hand them Whitehead's Process and Reality, right? Hand them my book, but no, I'm kidding. You have to meet people where they're at. You have to see what the challenges really are that they're struggling through, and
Yeah.
you have to be attentive to the availability of different options within the Christian tradition.
Mhm.
Evangelicalism is not as dominant as it is. It's not primarily the Christian expression historically, right? It's a rather modern expression.
Yeah.
And I often would draw on the whiteboard with my students like a pool, right? You have a pool. Here's a shallow end, a deeper end, and then you have a really deep end, and you have people who are learning to swim, people who are swimming, people who are scuba diving, right? The scholars, the philosophers. It's very hard for all of them to communicate.
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
we can, but you got to bring humanity to the conversation. It's not just about propositions, whether you can give assent to them. They have to connect to your personal reality, to your life, to your narrative. And that's something I think philosophers can get better at,
Well, it seems like you're doing a good job, especially if you're able to connect to a younger generation of students in some way. I like the
Mhm.
approach you took in terms of, just exploring, what they believe and how they can make that more their own. I also had the experience of teaching high school theology at the high school that I attended as a student. And it was when I was just finishing my master, starting my doctoral work, and I'm like all in on Teilhard, and I'm
Yeah.
teaching the sacraments to high school sophomores, like 16-year-old kids, and I'm like, oh man, like I have all these crazy thoughts running through my head regarding divinization and theosis and complexity and consciousness, so forth and so on. This is going to come out in some way to these kids. I just know it. So just, my prayer was like, God, let it be in the most grace-filled way possible. And I found that I was able to take a lot of those headier concepts of more complexity and greater awareness, and it kind of flowed naturally for me to be able to speak to this class, which was, the experience. There's a degree of familiarity there. You could see yourself sitting in those desks, just a
I
similar.
was, yeah,
Right.
same
And
desks.
it was a similar experience of I'm not going to tell you how to believe or what to believe. Rather, we're just going to approach this from a very open perspective, and
Yeah.
we're going to see what you get out of it. And the goal of this class is not for you to say that, you believe in Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior or whatever. The Catholic Church is the one who, no, it's for you to have more of a personal relationship with the universe in that way. And if you are to brand that as something personal where God is present to you, then God bless you. But, if not,
So,
yeah, yeah.
oh, sorry. Did you ever find yourself in some hot water then, with parents or faculty or?
No, no. And it was just a really natural unfolding. And I never had to get like, apologetic, like into apologetics, regarding like Catholicism or anything like that. And I think it's because I wasn't using any radical language or anything. It was really just trying to approach, okay, we're going to talk about, transubstantiation, so Thomas Aquinas talks about substance, accident, stuff like that. what the
Yeah.
heck does that really mean? Right. So we start using practical examples of things and whatnot, and it starts to resonate with them a bit more. And it's like, okay, but beyond just you going up to communion and receiving the Eucharist, like, let's expand that to the entire universe. Like, where do
Yeah.
you find Eucharist or communion, Thanksgiving within your family, your friend circles, your team, so forth, so on. So I think it was a
Mm.
very natural process, and there thankfully wasn't any hot water. The hot water comes more with um, adults I encounter who have very strong theological
Yeah.
opinions and biases. And they're often the folks that don't want to have their minds changed, and they just want to dialogue with you to have tension, which,
Sure.
I'm open to. I'm not an apologist in that way. I'm open to, like you said,
Mhm.
meet people where they are, hear their experience. But I've found that that's kind of what inspired my question to you regarding like your dialoguing with folks, is that I've found that in just a gentle approach and kind of sharing, well, this is the way that I've come to understand things or have a better relationship with God or have a better understanding with God.
Yeah.
It's not uncommon for people to come back to me months, years later and be like, when you were talking about that thing with Teilhard, it makes a lot of sense to me now because I've seen this happen in the world or I've experienced this in my life or something. So,
Yeah.
yeah, it's been filled with tension, but lots of grace, probably more grace than the than the
Well,
other.
the reason I asked is because my experience was overwhelmingly positive teaching
Great.
high school
Yeah.
kids. Of course, there were some moments, some parents who were very worried about the types of discussions we were having. But you and your Catholic background, we had one Catholic student in my class. The school's overwhelmingly Protestant, and we're talking about Genesis, right? And so all the Protestant kids are just rehearsing what they've been told. The Earth is quite young. And it's like 6,000, maybe younger, and Genesis is literal 4 days. And I had to give it to the Catholic student because he had actually read the Bible. He'd read some theology, and he said, "Well, I don't think that happened. I don't think that it's like that." Augustine, the early thinkers, didn't read it in a literal scientific way. And
Oh,
there's,
he had read Augustine too.
well,
Okay.
he'd read on this topic, yeah, which is rare
Yeah.
in a high school kid. But it created a fun sort of juncture in the class because it was a debate that we let stand. Of course,
Yeah.
I don't think the universe is a literal, 7 day creation, right? But I'm not going to insist that students think about the world in a certain way in this context. Rather, say the Christian tradition has had these warring perspectives on what this passage means and how best it relates to the best of human knowledge. And it's up to you to investigate, to think, to write, or what have you, and come to the best conclusion. So obviously the creation of the world is one of those topics which gets people fired up. So I had, some angry emails or hell, some hell must be eternal conscious torment. This is important for some parents. It's important
Yeah.
for the kids to believe that, or other, questions of homosexuality or what, or sin. I mean,
Hell's a good way to keep people in line, right?
anyway, so I think that the theme here is bringing a humanity and relationality to the conversations. I can still attend church myself and have evangelical friends, and if we want to go into those discussions, I'm happy to do so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Awesome. Thank you. So I like your pool analogy that you were just talking about, where you have the shallow end, getting a little deeper down to the deep end. If you're willing, let's take this to the Mariana Trench for the moment here.
Sure.
So how, and this is, as I share with you before we press record here, this is initially how I found your thought was through your work with philosophy of psychedelics, Mind at Large project in particular. How has process thought allowed you to foray into explore these more novel topics? Like you mentioned in our opening, psychedelics, extraterrestrial life, artificial intelligence. How has it allowed you to explore those fields, and why do you think, or to you, why do those fields matter?
Yeah, awesome. Great. I mean, they matter again because they clearly matter to the cultural consciousness because they're all the rage in current conversation, right? Contemporary discussions are absolutely fascinating with respect to psychedelics, which is booming, philosophy of psychedelics. I'm good friends with some of the world's best philosophers of psychedelics. Um, Extraterrestrial life, right? From the whole question of the status of life and mind in the universe to the ongoing saga surrounding UFO and UAP phenomenon, which is really interesting. I've been following that a lot. There's good philosophical work being done there. Of course, and to the whole question of AI and artificial intelligence and what this means. So I think your process thought initially pushes me to take these things seriously. One, because experience is fundamental, right?
Yeah.
Experience is where things are at. And so is novelty, though, right? So novelty emerges and strikes, like lightning, right? And think of AI like so quickly, even ChatGPT and all these other different AI platforms just totally revolutionizing what's possible for us in both good and bad ways. And the question of whether they're sentient or conscious, I mean, all this is in the philosophical literature. But I'd say first and foremost, because experience is fundamental, novelty is fundamental. We should expect, that if we encounter arguably extraterrestrial intelligence, we're going to be dealing with a form of experience, a form of life, mind, and perhaps value. Some of my recent work has been to unveil a really interesting history of process thinkers commenting on the status and extent of life and mind, the potential of extraterrestrial life. So my previous book, Metaphysics of Exo-Life, is partly a commentary on that.
Okay.
Psychedelics, I mean, why should we be able to have the kind of experiences that result from taking a psychedelic substance? What does that mean about the nature of consciousness, its limitations in waking states like this, or its extraordinary, explosion through these medicines? I mean, what does that mean about the status of mind? Why should that be possible?
Yeah.
So I think, again, a philosophy that puts experience first is going to have more to say about the mystery of psychedelic usage, what it is putting us in contact with. It's going to say more about the status between mind and brain, right? Ian McGilchrist, if you're familiar with his work, has a nice way of laying out three basic ways of relating the mind-body connection. One would be that the theory of emission, right? The brain emits consciousness like a steam engine emits smoke. Or there's transmission, right? Like a radio signal. In some sense, we're tuning into a frequency. The brain is the tuning instrument, which brings our conscious awareness into a clarified volume. So emission, transmission. He advocates permission, right? The brain is a permissive organ in the sense that it acts like a kind of filter, or its function is to hinder out the wider experiential influence of the universe, which is always there, but to block it out so that waking states of consciousness can actually happen, right? Because you and I right now are the whole universe is pushing in on us. We're not conscious of it. If we were, that would probably be like a psychedelic trip, right? But we're not. And there's some studies, psychedelic studies, near-death studies, that suggest that in these extraordinary experiences, the brain is not firing up like crazy. It's actually sort of shutting down in a way, right? And that suggests a kind of inverse correlation that when the brain is lessened in its activities, experience seems to widen.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there's a lot to say there, but psychedelics are raising again the question of the mind-body problem. I think we need a framework of experience to address that. The whole idea that we're exemplary and not an exception to the universe means that we're a type of alien species, right? I mean, quite literally on this planet, there's no reason to suggest that where experience has a foothold in reality, that there's not going to be other modes of experience beyond us. Yeah. So I think that's a reason to take life and experience beyond Earth much more seriously. And just coming to AI, I mean, again, the debate rages about, whether AI is conscious. Richard Dawkins suggesting after, hanging out with AI for a while, well, I can't say that it's not. Right, which is a bit too flippant. Yeah. Process thought challenges that. It challenges the notion that consciousness and experience is just a result of a kind of mechanical algorithm. Isn't there something unique about human consciousness, our engagement with value-laden perception, right? That is part and parcel of our experiencing, right? We can't just map that onto algorithmic outputs. So AI is quite good at, sort of, what's the right word? Imitating. Yeah, our into consciousness and intelligence, but that's quite different from actually being conscious and intelligent, right? So again, as McGilchrist, I think rightly says, we're dealing with artificial information processing, not necessarily artificial intelligence. But I want to leave open also the possibility that in a pan-experientialist frame, we can't utterly discount the possibility that perhaps in the future, right, we might be able to encounter, you know, conscious machines. But I am very skeptical of that, I think, at this point. But of course, I'm willing to be convinced otherwise should that happen.
Well, I appreciate your articulation of those topics and why they're relevant. I think that's important for people to hear. I don't truthfully know how much of my audience is exposed to that, kind of thinking. I
Yeah.
certainly know some of them are. We've dialogued about this kind of thing, and it's been a super rich and healthy dialogue. But I've also kind of going back to our, previous question of encountering tension with people when it comes to these more expansive and challenging topics, been met with such guttural refute of like, ugh, psychedelics, and it's been from, well, I'm not going to name any names, but it's been from people who you maybe like you wouldn't expect it, and you're like, oh, there's still so much work to do here. Not to say that I'm advanced anyway in my thinking, but I go back to Terence McKenna, and he talks about how when you have a society that has, for lack of a better word, criminalized nature and our relationship with it, as a lot of these substances find their precursors, at least within the natural world. And what does that say about ourselves as a culture? We're so infantilized, like
Yeah.
really approaching things like even spirituality, science, with a real infantile mind in some sense. So, I know you're coming again from the West Coast where that thought is much more progressive. And as I said before we
Yeah.
press record, yeah, your form of orthodoxy is different than what we have on the East Coast where I'm located. So, I appreciate all of the work that you're doing. And, like you said, the people that you're associated with doing to get this stuff out into the mainstream, because you said the word there, healing. It's about healing. It's about wholeness. And that is the goal of all of our inquiry to some extent, I would argue, right? Truth, discovery of truth, I think, is a discovery of healing and wholeness, at least as it's relative to us as individuals in our lives, but then also to the community. And these things all really expand and challenge, or they challenge us to expand beyond our paradigms that we've been raised with for both, our spiritual, religious background, as well as just how we see the world operating on a daily level.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I appreciate how you were able to, articulate a very eloquent perspective on that.
I appreciate that. Yeah. Well, and just to your comments about your friends or whoever that was who was aghast, at your statement about
Not so
psychedelics.
much friends as a more
Oh,
professional colleague, academic. Well, they're
sure, sure.
friends, but yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and just because we're talking about psychedelics, it's not some license for someone to go blow their mind out on psychedelics in like
No.
60s and 70s. That's not where the discussion's happening, right?
No.
The data is in about the positive benefits that low dose forms of psychedelic use can have for people, and fixing their post traumatic stress disorder, or one session ridding them from the desire to drink or to smoke, or healing in deep ways depression and whatnot. So I think there's been a propagandistic stigma against psychedelics for a long time. Now we're in a place where legally, philosophically, ethically, all that is coming back in very interesting ways. And again, I'm not someone who has tons of experience with psychedelics, but I think it's the questions it raises philosophically, what it accomplishes personally for people by way of healing and wholeness is not something you can just discount because you have because you've believed some propaganda about it. Okay,
Yeah.
so there's why have these things been hidden, or downplayed? Perhaps because they're essential to human beings waking up in a certain way, encountering the universe differently, right? The same thing applies to the UAP phenomenon, which again,
Yeah.
I think there's all reason to take the phenomenon seriously. What that means and how we interpret it are another conversation, but taking it seriously is not at all a wild thought to me. We have more than enough suggestions as to why we should take it seriously. So I mean, yeah, it's just we have to be careful about our own stigma that we bring to these things, and make sure we're doing due justice to see why it is that people are taking these conversations seriously. And McKenna, of course, was influenced by Whitehead and others, right? He's an important voice. And a number of my friends, scholars of process thought, first got into reading Whitehead through McKenna's work too. So very interesting.
Yeah, I definitely heard Terrence drop the name Whitehead and Teilhard before I knew who those people actually were. So it's been a while, but it's fun when I have the time to go back and listen to an old McKenna lecture, when I've just got to spare 3 hours laying around and listen to him, rant and ramble about, these concepts. But it's affirming when I hear those names come up again. It's like, and it's also, no shade at Terrence too, but it just shows the limitations of, his thought in those ways too, which his brother posthumously has come out and spoken a lot about now.
Really? I didn't know that.
Yeah, his brother Dennis is much more of a physical scientist, and in a bunch of candid interviews he's done more recently, he's said that I would be in the back of Terrence's talks going, "That's bullshit. Like, you can't say that. Like, that's utterly incorrect when it comes to what you just said about biology or something." So
interesting.
Yeah, but that's just brothers being brothers, I suppose, to a degree. So yeah,
sure.
Some healthy friction. Yeah.
Oh yeah, gotta have that.
Yeah, but that's all to say that he, like your friends, was such an inspiration for me to really start taking some liberties with this stuff. That, like you said, truth is important. And as I was trying to sort out my life as a young adult, these were all very pertinent questions that I had. So it's nice now as a bit more of a hopefully more mature person to be able to dialogue on these levels with it. So I greatly appreciate that. Yeah.
Oh, no doubt. Yeah.
Well, Andrew, I'm really grateful for all the wisdom and insight and information that you've been able to share today. This has been like a hard-hitting hour that we've been together. So I've done my best to keep up with you. I have all these notes I have written down here, things to read more myself, and I no doubt I know the audience will appreciate this. So as we get to wrapping up here, this question I ask all my guests: how do you find synergy with the sacred in your own life?
Nice. Well, I mean, there's any number of ways to do so, I think. And the first thing I'd say is that I'm not seeking something up there and out there beyond, right, this universe. Synergy with the sacred is about, for me, how to live more fully and participate in the reality we have here and now, So that would be through art, through music, through, walks in the woods, right? Thoreau wrote a beautiful essay, How to Walk in the Woods. He apparently walked 4 to 6 hours a day in the woods. I don't have time for that.
Okay.
But nature is something sacramental, right? To go back to your previous confidence, something under, in, and through which the reality of the sacred, the reality of God is made known. And generally, again, spirituality thinking on my frame is not about escape, right? It's about rendering experience transparent to the wider wilderness relations that we're in every moment caught up within. So acts of kindness, right? Compassion, attending to the rhythms we feel that are coming through us, the prompts to be and act in ways that might not initially seem, viable. I mean, something is being asked of us, I think, in a deep sense. I think of Abraham Joshua Heschel saying religion is essentially the question, right? What is asked of me? Something is seeking us and requires us to seek it as well. I think the sacred is dynamic, fluid, communicative, relational, and its results, the results of being, in synergy with the sacred, are manifest in a life well lived, in a life of wisdom, a life that's value productive. At least that's how I say it, and I do my best to try to live that out each day as well.
Appreciate that. Just out of curiosity, what kind of music are you into? You mentioned music as the first thing there.
Yeah. Oh man, that's a whole nother podcast. Yeah, I love all types of music. I think because music is about encountering life in the mode of pure feeling, right?
Yeah.
If you're in a coffee shop, for example, and you're just doing work on your computer without listening to your headphones, that's one form of experience. When you put on your headphones, though, you begin to encounter everything differently. Mm-hmm. And so I love everything from, dubstep and reggae music, and metal to trance, right? To synthwave, right? To classical music. big band tunes. I love all types of music, and I think music's been a teacher for me. And the universe, it turns out, is rather musical, right? There's been the ancient Greek tradition of the music of the spheres, the Om of the Hindu tradition, like the sacred has a sound.
Sure.
And one day I'd like to write a sonic theology, right? Which would be a sort of Whiteheadian take on the relationship of theology and sound.
Yeah. Do you play music yourself?
I used to play drums as a younger chap, not so much anymore, but I'm an avid listener and appreciator of all types of music. So,
well, man, yeah, that's always something I am excited to talk about. So that's why I happen to ask. But again,
cool.
We're really grateful for all that you've shared today. So before we sign off here, how can people connect with you, find more about your work? And you had mentioned earlier that you have this introduction to Whitehead coming out. So can you tell us a little bit about that too?
Yeah, you bet. Well, yeah, if people can follow me social media, adventure_Davis for Instagram or Facebook. AndrewMDavis.info is my website. I try to keep that updated with opportunities, publications, and sort of upcoming conferences. I have a YouTube channel too, folks can subscribe to. Again, try to keep that populated. And yeah, my next book coming out in October with Orbis Books is titled Whitehead's Universe, A Prismatic Introduction. And I got to tell you, man, it's been so much fun to write. It's taken 6 years because it's been interrupted over and over by different other writing projects, other events, but it's sort of haunted me throughout these years. So I finally finished it. I think it turned out really excellent. My goal was to write the next go-to introduction for years to come for, philosophy, theology students at grad and undergrad levels. So it's comprehensive, but it's conversational. And I'm excited to see it hit the culture and would be curious to see what you and your listeners think. So that's upcoming. I have another edited volume with Palgrave on the horizon called Value Beyond Earth, subtitled Explorations in Exo-Axiology. So it's all about the status of value and its extent, and has various contributions. And then that'll be out hopefully this year. And another essay collection of my work titled Whitehead and Recent Thought, Frontiers of Process-Relational Metaphysics, is on the horizon too. So a lot going on, and lots of conferences and planning and whatnot. So I'd just encourage folks to stay in touch. You can reach me via my website and elsewhere, and we can continue the conversation.
Awesome, brother. Thank you so much for sharing both everything that you've offered today in our conversation, as well as all of the reading lists that you've given for people to dive further into your work. So I'm really grateful for your time. We wish you all the best in all your ventures going forward, and I look forward to crossing paths with you sometime soon.
Thank you, brother. Appreciate it.
Thanks, man. We'll talk.